Baldwin still participated in certain heteronormative politics. Malcolm X said to James Baldwin, "I'm a warrior of the revolution and you're the poet." The thing that people are kind of spicy and curious about, since James Baldwin did say that Malcolm X might have been his soulmate, is, were they gay lovers? Were they gay for each other? All of my social media accounts, when I've been posting about James Baldwin, posting about Malcolm X, the thing that people are kind of spicy and curious about, since James Baldwin did say that Malcolm X might have been his soulmate, is, were they gay lovers? Were they gay for each other? We're not going to pontificate about that in this video, but I want to take us back in time once again. The year is 1961, and James Baldwin has agreed to do a debate with Malcolm X. This is during a period of time where the civil rights movement is in full swing. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King are very much at the height of their fame. Their political discourse and debate is very much in the public. James Baldwin wants to throw in on what is happening. I think this context is really interesting because James Baldwin and Malcolm X met each other for the first time on the public stage, debating national politics, using their logic, using their debate skills, using their ability to look at history and translating it in ways that are interesting to people. It says a lot about them as figures, and it is so cool that they met this way. At one point in their friendship, in their dynamic, that Malcolm X said to James Baldwin, "I'm a warrior of the revolution and you're the poet." And this stuck with Baldwin. I think through reading so much of Baldwin, you can see that he hungered to be a part of the civil rights movement, that he hungered to be accepted and understood by the larger Black community. So to have someone like Malcolm X support him probably meant a lot. But before we dig into their specific relationship, I want to break down some of the basics about both of these figures. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, was a prominent African-American civil rights leader, activist, Nation of Islam advocate, and revolutionary. His early life was marked by tragedy, with his father's death at the hands of white supremacists and his mother's subsequent mental breakdown, leading to his placement in foster care and eventual involvement in criminal activity. While serving a prison sentence, Malcolm converted to the Nation of Islam, a Black nationalist religious movement. The Nation of Islam organized greatly throughout all of the prisons throughout the 60s and 70s. They were a big proponent of why there was such a big Black power or prisoners' rights movements, especially in the 60s, because they organized so effectively. They were able to funnel people that went into jail through drugs and other illicit activities into these more structured lives that kind of mimicked some of the hyper-militancy of the Black Panther Party, which I think is interesting. While serving a prison sentence, Malcolm X converted to the Nation of Islam, a Black nationalist religious movement. Upon his release in 1952, he became a minister and spokesperson for the NOI, advocating for Black separatism and self-defense in the face of racial oppression. And what I think is interesting about this debate is that you can see kind of the wheels turning in both Baldwin and Malcolm X's head. They are both very good at referencing history, referencing different forms of literature. They're both good at bringing in material examples of racialized oppression alongside material examples of white supremacy. They both have a sense of humor. I think that is also something that really comes through. And some points that I want to mention is around 235. At one point in the debate, Malcolm X says, "I think that this, in my opinion, was why we disagree with the sit-in movement. If we're willing to wait for another 100 years for the white man to change his mind, to accept them as human beings, then they're wrong. But if they're willing to lay down their life tonight or in the morning in order that we can have what is ours right tonight or in the morning, then it is a good move. But as long as they're willing to wait for the white man to make up his mind and they're qualified to be respected as human beings, then I'm afraid that all of their waiting and their planning is for naught." One interesting distinction in how James Baldwin and Malcolm X both dive into racialization is that James Baldwin they agree on a certain level. Baldwin is very much a supporter of the fact that racialization altogether can be a destructive force, that the notion of racial hierarchy is a destructive force. And you can see that Baldwin returns to this a lot and a lot again in this work. He says in this discussion with Malcolm X,
"There is nobody in the world, I think, sadder than a white man in the deep South who only has his skin and his blue eyes and his yellow hair."
How bigotry erases our humanity. And this can be bigotry towards oneself, bigotry towards others, the erasure of other people's history. So Baldwin is very clear on this. But I think on some level, Baldwin at this point is still able to articulate some of the hope that Blacks and whites or whatnot may come together. But Baldwin still definitely does have very succinct criticisms of the white elite and moderate. Malcolm X, he also is against kind of these forms of racialization, but I think he's more against it in terms of how racialization has been articulated in the processes of colonization. Both James Baldwin and Malcolm X are very ardently against colonization, but I think they're both very aware of the negative effects of colonization and how it relates to the Black body and how the Black body exists and operates within the context of the United States of America. I think is very useful, very interesting. It's why I think Baldwin, on some level, aligns with Malcolm X a little bit more because of the realness, because of the anger of what he's presenting. But you can also see at various points throughout James Baldwin's career that he's also against militancy to some degree. But of course, in the coming years, with the oncoming assassinations, a lot of that in James Baldwin's personality and political outlook would change. He would turn more towards supporting youth movements and militancy. I love being able to look back at history and understand the nuances of how people related to movements. I think just like today, how I, as an organizer, as a Black anarchist, am against certain inherent demands for nonviolence and peaceful protesting that I think certain parts of the Black political movement will advocate for. I'm not against that shit. And so it's cool for me as a modern day revolutionary and radical to look at the past and be able to analyze very clearly, here are the ways that James Baldwin and Malcolm X found common ground. Here are the ways that they understood and cared about each other. Here are the ways that they were able to articulate this on the public stage. Going beyond 1961, James Baldwin and Malcolm X are aligning very much in terms of wanting more for their people and being frustrated with the natural state of the mass Black political movement and leaning more towards a deeper Black militancy that would be represented by the Black Panther Party, by the Black Power movement, by the Black Liberation Army. And this is also shown in Baldwin's work during this same year, 1961. In 1961, James Baldwin wrote a piece for Harper's Magazine titled "The Dangerous Road Before Martin Luther King." I mean, he pushed for the March on Washington, he pushed for voting rights, and especially with the Vietnam War on the horizon and ravaging so much of our national politics and Black people being drafted abroad, you can see turning more towards a politics that wanted to center, especially near the late 1960s, on economics, on labor rights, on basically attacking poverty in a way that would kind of bridge the gap between racial justice and economic justice. And in a lot of ways, this is what scared the establishment in terms of in the end of Martin Luther King's life. And it's why a lot of people say that he was targeted, especially near the end, why he was eventually assassinated. Similar things can be said for Malcolm X. Near the end of his life, between 1961 and 1965, when he was killed, Malcolm X fell out with the Nation of Islam. He had a lot of very valid critiques about Elijah Muhammad and the double standards that Elijah Muhammad held himself to versus members of the Nation of Islam.
There has been much written and said about your departure from the Black Muslim organization. Could you tell us exactly why you did leave the organization?
Well, the exact I didn't leave, number one. I was put out, no matter, and since there was no justification for them putting me out, they had to make it appear to the public that I left of my own volition. But it was in February of 1963 that Wallace Muhammad, one of the sons of Elijah Muhammad, pointed out to me that his father had a very serious moral problem, which he had kept a careful secret up to that point. But that when I heard about it, I went directly to Elijah Muhammad. We discussed it. He explained it. He even admitted it to me, as well as to his some of his other children. He discussed it with his other children. But when he gave me his religious interpretation or explanation of it, I accepted it. But about 5 months went by, and Wallace pulled me aside again and told me that his father hadn't changed. He was still involved in the same thing.
This led to increased surveillance. Malcolm X's star kind of climbs. He is both being targeted and surveyed by the state and being targeted and surveyed by the Nation of Islam. And throughout the rest of their years, James Baldwin and Malcolm X would see each other in passing. Despite the fact that James Baldwin did call Malcolm X his soulmate, I kind of see throughout their works that they were very much in passing with each other. I assume they saw each other at events. They probably had some private conversations, but I don't know how much in deep coalition they were. And that's something that I kind of want to dig into later on in relation to the 60s and how Baldwin portrays his relation to these movements and these men that have been slain. Were James Baldwin and Malcolm X friends? How close were they? There's also this other kind of lore out there about Malcolm X potentially being queer, bisexual, not straight. And I'm going to put some references on the screen, but there has basically been lore out there for a period of time that in his days of like drug dealing and being on the streets, which eventually led him to go to jail and to be radicalized in jail, that for a period of time, Malcolm X might have been a sex worker and that he might have been a sex worker that engaged with men and women. And I think in terms of like our historical imagery and mindset, it is important not to assert what someone in the past, what their sexuality was, unless it was written about or they expressed it themselves. But I do think it is important to not shut off history from certain possibilities that people are aware of in different capacities. And I think on one level, it is interesting looking at Malcolm X in relation to other Black men of the movement of his time, because you can see MLK was a little iffy about James Baldwin's queerness. Eldridge Cleaver was definitely antagonistic. There were also white people that shitted on James Baldwin for his queerness and his perspective. Malcolm X, I think, from the very start, respected James Baldwin very much. It is also known through James Baldwin's writings that him and Malcolm X did meet before 1961. And I want to read in No Name in the Street, James Baldwin writes, "I had heard a great deal about Malcolm, as had everyone else, and I was a little afraid of him, as was everyone else, and I was further handicapped by having been out of the country for so long. When I returned to America, I again went to the South, and thus imperceptibly found myself mainly on the road. I saw Malcolm before I met him. I had just returned from someplace like Savannah. I was giving a lecture in New York, and Malcolm was sitting in the first or second row of the hall, bending forward at such an angle that his long arms nearly caressed the ankles of his long legs, staring up at me. I was very nearly panicked. I knew Malcolm only by legend, and this legend, since I was a Harlem street boy, I was sufficiently astute to distrust. I distrusted the legend because we in Harlem had been betrayed so often. Malcolm might be the torch the white people claimed he was, though in general, white America's evaluations of these matters would be laughable and even pathetic, did not have these evaluations have such wicked result. Or he might be the hustler I remembered from my pavements. On the other hand, Malcolm had no reason to trust me either, and so I stumbled through my lecture with Malcolm never taking his eyes from my face. It must be remembered that in those great days, I was considered to be an integrationalist. This was never quite my own idea of myself, and Malcolm was considered to be a racist in reverse. This formulation in terms of power, and power is the arena in which racism is acted out, means absolutely nothing. It may even be described as a cowardly formulation. The powerless, by definition, can never be racist, for they can never make the world pay for what they feel or fear except by the suicidal endeavor which makes them fanatics or revolutionaries or both. Whereas those in power can be urbane and charming and invite you to those which they know they will never own. The powerless must do their own dirty work. The powerful have it done for them. This context is very interesting, especially Baldwin noting his understanding of how the public perceived him to be an integrationalist and how the public perceived Malcolm to be a racist in reverse. And I love that Baldwin makes the clarification that people that are subjugated can't hold power against those that subjugate them, and how this lobbying of criticism of Malcolm X being racist isn't actually true in terms of how we see power dynamics play out. I love this interaction because you see that James Baldwin has somewhat of a distrust for another figure in the movement. You see that James Baldwin respects Malcolm X, that he finds him beautiful, captivating, interesting. And I'm really interested in how their intimate interactions were. I could imagine Malcolm X being a great supporter of James Baldwin and vice versa. I can imagine how devastating it probably was when James Baldwin learned that Malcolm X had been assassinated in 1965, only a few years after they had initially met. I think if you watch the documentary Meeting the Man, which I featured in my last Baldwin video, you can see that these killings, these murders, deeply affected James Baldwin. And it shows up in a lot of his language. He says, "They were killing my friends, these are my people, it really hurt." My last consideration for this video is the question of how close was James Baldwin actually to these people in the movement, like Medgar Evers, like Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King, which he so ardently wanted to write about. And there is some perspective out there on whether or not James Baldwin was actually close to these people. And it's in this book that I have right here. I actually read this book maybe like 2 years ago, and it's called Talking at the Gates, A Life of James Baldwin by James Campbell. I would say in terms of my own ranking of James Baldwin biographies, this is definitely like number 2 under David Lemming's biography on James Baldwin. I would say read that one and then read this one. But the reason I love this one is because, especially near the latter end, it delves into some really, I think, interesting and valid critiques and perspectives on Baldwin, which aren't so glossy and fun and cool and interesting. Like, he really kind of reads Baldwin for filth in certain ways. And I want to dig into a section of this that kind of explores whether or not Baldwin was actually close with these people. Baldwin began to fear, and who could say that this was not within his rights, that he would be next. Someone might have easily considered it a useful strike against Black power or just against Blacks, to take a shot at the highly visible, outspoken writer. Yet, his trepidation, while justified, was also disproportionate. Baldwin's importance to the movement was considerable, but not as great as he seems at times to have believed it was. What did he mean, for example, by telling Injun Césaire just a week after King's death that he was now the Black elder statesman, and that he was the only mobile Black American left? And although the FBI was certainly keeping a close eye on his movements, it was overstating the case to assume, as he did, that they had his every change of direction covered and his conversations taped. Medgar, Malcolm, and Martin, he frequently repeated the tragic refrain, which were, each in his own way, in a different category of civil rights leadership from Baldwin, as was their contemporary avatar, Stokely Carmichael, to whom Baldwin considered himself the older brother. He seriously believed that he was in as much danger physically as Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, says Kenton Keith, a friend from the Istanbul days and cultural attaché to the U.S. Embassy there. He wasn't. Yet Baldwin persisted in his disbelief, once more involuntarily compressing the matter of his daily life into legend as the details of actual experience began to fade. During the 11 years of their acquaintance, he had met King at irregular intervals, had been ever ready to speak at marches, and had exchanged sporadic correspondence with him. Yet in a life profile of 1971, he is found casting the relationship in terms of public and private equals, referring first to Medgar, Malcolm, and Martin and me, he continued. We, Baldwin and King, had been young together. We trampled over the South together. We had even dared to hope together. In an interview the year before, he pointed to the catalog of assassinations. I loved Medgar. I loved Martin and Malcolm, and continued, we all worked together and kept the faith together. This distinction about Baldwin, I think, is fascinating and interesting and necessary to look at. I have been an organizer since 2014. I've been writing since 2008. In a lot of ways, my organizing life has existed alongside my writing life, but my organizing life has transformed the way that I write, the way that I talk about political issues, the way that I write about political movements, the way that I engage in political spaces. I think he is more of an advocate for the causes that he was organizing around and less of an organizer. Labels and distinctions in terms of history matter, because if Baldwin viewed himself as a fellow peer alongside Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, in what ways did he view himself as a peer? Being Black men in the struggle to bring consciousness and truth to the masses. But in terms of what that truth represented and how that truth challenged people and what that meant on an actionable level, Baldwin produced art and debated about it and engaged with people in very real and material ways. But being an organizer and bringing people together and raising funds and directing campaigns and hosting trainings and all of those other things is a very distinctively different skill set, although it is related to the process of being an artist. There is this sadness that I read in these later kind of critiques or considerations of Baldwin maybe not being as close to these figures as he said that he was. But I think this is also a symptom of him being Black and queer and radical, and how those experiences can otherize you from a movement, while also Baldwin is someone that feels a great sense of love and nostalgia and almost like permission for the men around him, which is why I think a lot of people criticize Baldwin on certain levels for not going as hard as he could about misogyny and misogynoir. And I think some of that is a symptom of the fact that Baldwin was queer and not totally like... Baldwin still participated in certain heteronormative politics, although he turned against others. Were Baldwin and Malcolm X friends? How close was Baldwin in general to other people in the movement? Did he hyperbolize these things? A lot can be left up to consideration, although there is some evidence in the past. What do you think? Do you think Baldwin and Malcolm X were close? Did they have a kinship that was maybe stronger than Baldwin and some of the other men in the movement? Why? Could Malcolm X maybe have been queer, and did Baldwin hyperbolize his connection to these people in order to feel closer to the Black community, especially as someone who is always on the go and always on the move? Tell me what you think and comment with what other things you might want to learn about James Baldwin.